In a future where storms tear apart technology, Buck Harper, a farmer on the edge of survival, stumbles upon something no one should ever find: a wounded, mechanical dragon being hunted by a ruthless corporation. With everything at risk, Buck must decide: save the creature and risk his life, or turn his back and lose it all. The clock is ticking, and the storm is only the beginning. Can he escape the corporate grip, or is this the last stand for both man and beast? If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's jump into the story. New Helios was a place where storms ruled, and not the kind most people were used to. It wasn't the rain that got under your skin, or even the wind that howled through the vast, empty plains. No, it was the electromagnetic storms, the ones that struck every harvest season. These storms came with a predictable cruelty, like a twisted joke from the universe. If you were a farmer like Buck Harper, you knew what to expect. The storms scrambled all the tech, turning smart tractors into useless heaps of metal. The powerful magnetic fields interfered with everything: radios, wrist communicators, even the air traffic systems. You couldn't trust anything, not your equipment, not your schedule, and certainly not your luck. Buck's hoverhauler groaned as he climbed out. The engine coughed and the gravity stabilizer screamed in protest, sounding more like a mechanical banshee than a well-oiled machine. He didn't care. He was used to it. Out here in New Helios, you learned to make do with what you had. The metallic rain that fell from the sky soaked through his coveralls, a result of the terraforming process that was always glitching. The planet's weather was unpredictable, much like the politicians that ran it. But Buck didn't have time to dwell on that. The harvest awaited, and so did the inspection. The timer on his wrist buzzed, reminding him that the crop inspection by the Colonial Agricultural Authority was just 30 minutes away. Miss this, and it could cost him his farm license for the season. Buck knew that well enough, but as he squinted against the storm, something else caught his eye. Not the usual trouble with the crops or the machines, but something much stranger. Something out of place. At the edge of his soybean field, where the automated irrigation system met the wasteland, a barren stretch of land nobody had bothered to claim, Buck saw a shape. At first, he thought it might be debris from one of those corporate shuttles that occasionally crashed. After all, New Helios had a magnetic field that didn't play nice with navigation systems. Shuttles came down every now and then, their pilots misjudging the planet's strange magnetic quirks. But this shape wasn't just a pile of wreckage. It moved. It breathed. Buck's boots thudded against the wet ground as he walked cautiously toward the form. With every step, the heavy rain whipped at his face, and the air hummed with static, the storm's electric charge settling over everything. The shape on the ground was larger than any animal he'd ever seen. The closer he got, the more he could make out its details. Scales, shimmering between shades of blue and silver like oil on water. It looked like something out of an old legend, a creature his grandmother had told him about when he was a kid. But this wasn't some mythical beast from a bedtime story. This was real, and it was alive. Buck's heart beat faster as he knelt beside the creature. It was enormous, its wings twitching weakly, its body battered and scorched. The sight was enough to stop him in his tracks. Something wasn't right. He had to get closer. Cautiously, he reached out, his fingers brushing the wet scales. The dragon, for that's what it was, barely moved, but a low sound, almost like a groan, escaped from it. Not just any sound, this was mechanical, like a fusion engine struggling to start underwater. "You alive over there?" Buck called out, his voice cutting through the air thick with static. His words felt out of place, almost absurd. Who talks to a creature like this? But the storm was loud, and the silence between them was worse. His wrist communicator buzzed again, this time louder, reminding him of the inspection that was still hanging over his head. He knew it would be a risk to ignore it, but he couldn't just walk away from what he was seeing. The creature's eye flickered open. Not a normal eye. This one was a strange mix of organic and mechanical. The iris dilated with a soft mechanical whir, scanning him in 3 different spectrums. Buck froze. He'd never seen anything like it. The dragon's other eye remained shut, half hidden beneath the folds of its battered wings, and then, to his disbelief, the dragon spoke. "Just kill me already," it said in perfect colonial standard, its voice layered with a harmonic hum that made Buck's teeth ache. "Make it quick. I'm worth more dead than alive." Buck stumbled backward, his mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. A dragon, speaking to him, asking to be killed. It was too much. But living on New Helios had taught him how to handle the strange. He'd seen enough weird things to keep his head steady. At least, that's what he told himself. "Lady or sir, or whatever dragons prefer," Buck said, his voice calm, despite the chaos swirling around them. "I don't make a habit of killing folks who ask politely. Or impolitely, for that matter." The dragon shifted, trying to lift its head, but it faltered. Its right wing hung at an odd angle, the bones clearly broken. And the most disturbing thing, Buck had missed it at first, was the collar around its neck. The kind that colonial authority used on dangerous creatures, a device meant to restrain and paralyze. "You don't understand," the dragon wheezed, the words coming out in short bursts. "They'll come for me. When they find me here, they'll take your farm, your license, everything. The Salverson Corporation doesn't leave witnesses." Buck felt a chill run down his spine. The name was familiar. Salverson Corp. Everyone had heard of them. They ran the wildlife rehabilitation centers. Or at least, that's what they claimed. But no one ever saw the animals again. Instead, they were turned into expensive luxuries. Dragon-scale handbags, for example, were the latest craze in the inner colonies. It was a cruel business, a business that made Buck sick to his stomach. He had heard of the corporation's operations, stories of dark labs and twisted experiments, but he never thought he'd be caught up in something like this. Buck glanced at the dragon, then at his farm. The inspection timer buzzed again. Time was running out. But it wasn't just about the inspection anymore. It was about what was right. "Guess we better make sure they don't find you," Buck muttered under his breath, pulling out his pocket knife. A ridiculous weapon against a creature like this, but it gave him something to do with his hands. As Buck examined the collar, he realized this wasn't going to be easy. But something about the dragon's pain, its plea for help, struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure what he was getting into, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away. Buck stood frozen, the weight of the situation sinking in as he stared at the dragon. It wasn't just any creature. It was something far worse, something far more dangerous. The dragon's breathing was shallow, ragged, as though every breath was a struggle against the pain coursing through its body. It wasn't the mythical beast from stories or children's books. This one was different. This one had been altered, transformed by forces far beyond anything Buck could have imagined. The dragon, who had pleaded for death only moments ago, now stared at him with that one glowing eye, the mechanical iris slowly adjusting to the light. "You don't understand," it gasped. "They'll come for me. They find me here, they'll destroy everything. Your farm, your crops, your life. The Salverson Corporation doesn't leave anything behind." Salverson Corporation. The name rang in Buck's ears like a warning bell. Everyone on New Helios had heard of them, and not in the way you'd hear about a company with good intentions. Salverson was a corporation that specialized in wildlife rehabilitation, or at least, that's what they called it. In truth, their so-called centers were places where creatures like this dragon were captured, broken down, and turned into luxury goods. They used creatures like dragons for their scales, claws, and even their bones, crafting them into high-priced fashion items for the elite in the inner colonies. But this wasn't just another animal farmed for luxury. This was a sentient creature, a being capable of thought and speech, and Buck had no idea how deep the corporation's involvement went. "I wasn't supposed to survive," the dragon continued, its voice weak but filled with something Buck couldn't place. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. "They've been tracking me for weeks. You don't know what they'll do when they find me here. They'll take you down too. Your farm will be nothing more than a burned-out husk." Buck stepped back, his mind racing. He'd seen a lot in his years on New Helios, decades of hard work, strange storms, and corporate greed. But this was something else entirely. The reality of the dragon's words hit him harder than any storm ever had. If he helped this creature, if he even attempted to, he was risking everything. But if he turned his back on it, if he left it to die, he couldn't live with that either. He glanced at the dragon's body again, his gaze drawn to the collar that circled its neck. It was a high-tech device, something designed to keep the creature under control. Buck recognized it immediately. It was an inhibitor collar, used by the colonial authority on dangerous creatures. But this one wasn't just a simple restraint. It had been modified, adapted for a more sinister purpose. "That collar, it's designed to paralyze you, isn't it?" Buck asked, his voice softer now. He wasn't sure why he asked. Maybe he just needed confirmation. Or maybe he hoped the dragon would tell him it wasn't as bad as it seemed. The dragon nodded, its head barely moving. "Yes, it was made to keep me still, keep my scales intact for harvesting. They want me to be a trophy, a luxury good, not a living being. My entire existence is nothing but a product to them." Buck felt a pang of anger stir within him. The thought of this creature being reduced to nothing more than an object, something to be bought and sold like a piece of jewelry, was more than he could bear. And yet, that was the world they lived in on New Helios. It was a world where power and greed ruled everything. And in the midst of all that, this dragon had somehow found itself trapped, unable to escape the fate that awaited it. "How did you end up like this?" Buck asked. "I was part of a project, one of many. They create these creatures, modify them to serve a purpose, and then they use them until they're no longer needed. When the project failed, I was discarded." Buck's heart sank. The idea of a creature being created, tortured, and then thrown away like trash was something he couldn't wrap his mind around. New Helios had its fair share of problems, but he never imagined something so cruel could happen right under their noses. "There are more of you?" Buck asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't imagine how many others were out there, living in fear, waiting for the day they'd be used up. The dragon's eye darkened. There were. But they've all been processed. You see, Salverson doesn't just let us go. They don't allow us to live freely. If they find me, they'll kill me, and they'll kill anyone who tries to help me. Buck felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The decision was no longer just about whether to help a creature in. It was about survival. About whether he could live with himself after making this choice. He looked at the dragon one last time. its scales glistening in the dim light of the storm. It wasn't a creature from a storybook, a fairy tale where everything turned out fine in the end. This was real, and helping it might cost him everything. But leaving it to die? That was something he couldn't do. So what now? Buck asked, his voice steadier than he felt. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, his life was about to change forever. The dragon didn't answer immediately. Instead, it closed its eyes, its mechanical iris flicking shut with a soft whir. And in that moment, Buck understood. This wasn't just a fight for the dragon's freedom. It was a fight for something bigger, something that could change everything for New Helios. Now, we survive, the dragon said quietly. Together. Buck nodded, determination setting in. It was time T. The storm was getting worse, and so were the stakes. For the first time in years, Buck felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone anymore, and together, they might just have a chance. Buck stood in front of his barn, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. The storm raged overhead, but the real storm was coming. Salverson Corporation's retrieval team. Buck had heard the roar of military-grade engines in the distance. Their sound, unmistakable. They were closing in fast, and if he didn't act quickly, he'd lose everything. He turned to the dragon, still weak and barely able to move. "We need to get you out of here," Buck said, his voice steady, but his mind filled with urgency. "We can't stay here." The dragon, whose name Buck now knew to be Zara, gave him a look of gratitude mixed with worry. "You're risking everything," Zara said, her voice raspy. "If they find me, they'll destroy you." "They're going to destroy me anyway," Buck muttered under his breath. But he didn't say it to sound brave. He said it because it was true. The colonial authorities had no love for independent farmers like him. They didn't care about what was right or wrong. They only cared about control, about the crops and the tech. And if he lost his license, he'd lose everything. His land, his farm, his way of life. Buck glanced around, his eyes scanning the horizon as he thought quickly. There was no time to waste. He couldn't outrun them, and he certainly couldn't outfight them. But maybe, just maybe, he could outsmart them. "I've got an idea," Buck said, more to himself than to Zara. "But it's risky. You trust me?" Zara lifted her head slightly, her mechanical eye narrowing as she studied Buck. "Do I have a choice?" Buck smiled grimly, a hint of confidence returning. Not really. He quickly motioned for Zara to follow him, although she was moving slowly. Her legs shook with every S, and Buck could see that she was in agony, but there was no time to waste. They had to get to the barn, and they had to do it without alerting the salvage team to their presence. The barn was hidden in plain sight. On official records, it didn't exist. But it wasn't a hole in the ground or an abandoned shack. It was a well-built structure, and it had a secret, an ancient technology buried deep under its floorboards. It was a relic from the predecessors, a long-lost alien race that once inhabited New Helios. The tech had been dormant for centuries, but it still worked, and Buck had learned to use it to his advantage. "Here," Buck said, leading Zara to the barn's back door. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, a strange little piece of tech that looked like it belonged in a museum. It was a sensor jammer, something that interfered with the scanning equipment the salvage team would be using. He'd bought it years ago from a shady merchant, who had sworn it was predecessor gray. Buck didn't know what that meant, but he didn't care. He'd used it before to get around checkpoints and avoid detection from the colonial authorities. Now, it was the only hope they had. "This will give us some time," Buck said, flipping the switch on the jammer. It sent out a pulse, and immediately the air around them seemed to hum. The barn's exterior, vanished from the sensors of the approaching military team, making it appear as if it didn't exist at all. Zara looked at him with surprise. "How did you—" "Long story," Buck interrupted. "We don't have time for that. Just get inside and stay quiet." They both hurried into the barn. Buck shut the door behind them, and for a moment there was a strange, tense silence. He could hear the engines of the salvage team drawing closer, the sound of their pursuit unmistakable. Buck's heart pounded in his chest, but he focused. Now wasn't the time to panic. Now was the time to act. Zara collapsed onto the floor. Period. Her breathing labored as she tried to catch her breath. Buck didn't know how much longer she could keep going, but he couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to hiding her. He walked over to the barn's corner and pulled out a tarp. It wasn't just any tarp. It was lined with material that deflected sensors, something he'd picked up from that same shady merchant. Buck threw it over Zara, careful not to touch her too much, but trying to make sure the tarp covered her body. "This should work," Buck muttered, trying to stay calm. "They won't be able to scan inside, at least not with anything they have. We just need to wait it out." Just then, the sounds of the salvage team's engines grew louder. Buck felt his pulse race. He glanced around the barn, his eyes landing on the makeshift still he'd built in the corner, a leftover relic from his grandfather's moonshine days. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The barn wasn't just a hiding place. It was a fortress, built from 1,000 little secrets. And right now, those secrets were the only thing standing between them and the salvage team. Buck took a deep breath and turned to Zara. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "And whatever you do, don't breathe plasma." Zara gave him a sharp look. "I don't breathe fire," she said, the sarcasm thick in her voice. "That's a racist stereotype. I breathe superheated plasma." "Even worse," Buck said with a grin, trying to break the tension. "Don't breathe that either." Just as he finished speaking, the door to the barn creaked. Buck held his breath. They were here. He could hear them outside, their boots heavy against the wet earth, the sound of their voices cutting through the storm. Buck stepped back, his fingers twitching with anxiety. He had no idea how long they'd have before the team figured out something was wrong. The barn was the perfect hiding place. At least, it had to be. The leader of the salvage team, a gruff man with a voice that sounded like gravel being ground underfoot, spoke up. "Mr. Harper," he called out, "we're tracking a dangerous specimen, a Class 7 dragon. Have you seen anything unusual?" Buck took a slow breath, standing tall by the barn door, trying his best to act casual. "Unusual?" he said, his voice dripping with feigned indifference. "This is New Helios. Last week, it rained fish. A few days ago, gravity reversed for an hour. You'll have to be more specific." The lead agent didn't answer right away. Buck held his breath again, hoping that his bluff would work. If they didn't find anything, they'd leave. But if they did, it would all be over. The silence inside the barn was deafening. Buck's heart hammered in his chest as he stood near the door, waiting for the salvage team to make their next move. Every second felt like an eternity. The faint hum of the storm outside mixed with the sounds of boots crunching in the mud, and for a moment, Buck thought he might suffocate in the tension. The team was just outside, their voices low but filled with purpose. He could hear the leader's gravelly voice cutting through the air, giving orders to the others. Buck wasn't sure how much time they had left. Every minute they spent here was another minute closer to being discovered. But he had no intention of letting that happen, not when he was so close to getting Zara to safety. Zara lay beneath the tarp, motionless, her breathing slow but steady. Buck had done his best to keep her still, to hide her from the scanning devices the team would undoubtedly use. But he knew that even with the jammer working, they couldn't stay hidden forever. The storm would give them a small advantage, but it wouldn't last long. The leader of the salvage team spoke again. "Mr. Harper?" His voice echoed through the barn. "We know you're hiding something. We have thermal scans. We can track your movements." Buck felt his palms sweat as he pressed his back against the barn door. He had to think quickly. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. "You tracking me?" Buck said, his voice casual, but laced with a thin edge of sarcasm. "I wouldn't waste your time. New Helios has a way of messing with things. Last week, the soil started glowing green. Who knows what's next?" The leader's voice paused, and for a moment, there was a brief silence. Buck held his breath, trying to keep his body still. The seconds felt like they were dragging, and he knew that at any moment, the salvage team could break down the door. They could find Zara, find him, and everything would be over. The farm, the dragon, his freedom, gone in an instant. "We'll have to take a look inside," the agent said, his voice sharp with suspicion. Buck's stomach dropped. They were getting too close. But Buck had prepared for this. As the agent stepped forward, his armored boots heavy on the barn floor. Buck quickly pulled out a small device from his pocket. It was an old trick he had learned from his grandfather, a relic of the past, but it had its uses. The device was a colonial charter override, an old piece of tech that would send a signal to the team's equipment, forcing it to malfunction for a few seconds. Just enough time for Buck to act. He pressed the button. Instantly, the barn's exterior shimmered for a brief moment, and the scanning device the agent held went silent. Buck could feel the pressure lifting, but he knew it wouldn't last long. The device had only given them a few precious seconds of cover. "What the hell?" the agent muttered, stepping back, his voice growing more frustrated. "There's something wrong with the scans." Buck took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Like I said," he replied, "New Helios is full of surprises. Some things just don't show up on scanners. Maybe your equipment's just not up to date." The lead agent was silent for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Buck could hear him mumbling something to his team. He could hear their footsteps as they moved around the barn, checking every corner, every possible hiding place. Then the agent spoke again, and this time, his voice was cold. "We don't need a warrant to search your property, Mr. Harper. We have the authority to—" "Actually, you do need a warrant," Buck interrupted, his voice rising with confidence. Section 15, subsection 32 of the New Helios Colonial Charter. No search without judicial authorization, unless there's a direct threat to security. And unless that dragon's got a nuclear warhead under its scales, you're not getting in. The agent scoffed, but Buck could hear the hesitation in his voice. The law was on his side. And for the first time since this all started, Buck felt like he might actually have a chance of winning. "This is your last warning, Mr. Harper," the agent growled. "Step aside, or we'll be forced to take action." Buck didn't move. He couldn't. Not now. Not when Zara's life, and his own, hung in the balance. The standoff between them stretched on, each second dragging on like an eternity. But finally, the agent spoke again, his voice low, threatening. "You're making a mistake, Harper. We know you're hiding something. When we find out what, it's going to be the end of you." Buck didn't flinch. He stood his ground, a silent promise in his eyes. "You'll never find it," he said quietly, "because it's not yours to take." The agent didn't respond immediately, and in that moment, Buck realized they might be backing down. The law was clear. Buck had done everything right, everything by the book, and the salvage team knew it. They could threaten all they wanted, but they didn't have the legal authority to take action without a warrant. Finally, the lead agent gave a sharp order, and the salvage team began to retreat. Buck watched through the cracks in the barn door, his breath held tight in his chest. The sound of the team's footsteps faded, and for a brief moment, he thought they might just leave. And then, the agent spoke one last time. "We'll be watching you, Harper. We know what you've done, and we'll be back." Buck nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "You do that," he said. "Just make sure you stay out of my fields." As the team disappeared into the distance, Buck let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was over. For now. He turned to Zara, who was still lying beneath the tarp. "You're safe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." Zara's eye flickered open, and she gave him a look of quiet gratitude. "Thanks," she said softly. "I don't know what comes next, but for now, you saved me, and that's more than I ever thought I'd have." Buck smiled, though it was tired. The storm outside was still raging, but for the first time in hours, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't over yet, but for now, they had won.